Thank you, Rajlakshmi, and good afternoon, everybody. So we have been talking about mainly about symptoms till now, and in the first class we talked about not only the physical factors, but we have to also address the psychosocial and spiritual suffering of the patients. So today we are going to talk about psychosocial issues and how to interpret those issues and what can be done in such instances. So today's session will be handled by Ms. Shreya. Shreya, basically, she is a psychologist and she has worked in various fields like rehabilitation, conference management, and many other fields. But after that, she did a um, 1 year program from Indian Institute of Management in healthcare management. And thereafter, she joined Palin India as a resource mobilization manager. And she actually has many hobbies, or she wants to work in many other fields like she loves animals a lot. Then she also interested in environment, environmental problems, waste management, etc. So she's a multi-talented person. So Shreya, welcome, and it's over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sunil. Thank you, Rajlakshmi. Welcome, everyone. And thank you all for being here in these really difficult times. And we really appreciate all of you joining us today. Yes, I wouldn't say I'm multi-talented, but I'm definitely a jack of all trades when it comes to the work I've done and what I've studied. So today's, just let me screen share. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, in presenter view, yes,
yeah,
perfect.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So yes, I'm working as a resource mobilization manager at Padium. I look into various aspects, which includes fundraising, also into project management and strategic partnerships and various things at Padium. In terms of currently, I'm at my hometown, which is in UP, and currently I'm taking care of my dad and my grandmom with COVID. So this has been an experience for me as well. And I'm glad. I want to also bring up the current scenario in terms of just more than the current pandemic and the physical problems that it causes. There are various psychosocial issues that have arose, not just for the patients, for the healthcare workers and everyone who's facing it. And even for people who haven't faced it, by just seeing the news or reading about it does cause so many reactions and things within ourselves. So this session is important, not just because we are all learning about palliative medicine and care. It's just it is important for us to look at any human being and look at the psychosocial aspects and understand them better. Um, all of us have been we've all been read about the approach about palliative care. You've gone through this definition. It is an approach that improves the quality of life of patients and their families and problems associated with life-threatening illness through the prevention and relief of suffering by means of early identification and impeccable assessment. When we say impeccable assessment, we will go into techniques of assessment that can be used. Also, treatment of pain and other problems that could be physical, psychosocial, and spiritual. As Dr. Sunil had mentioned that you learned about pain management, symptom management. This session will only focus on the psychosocial aspect. So what is total pain? Frankly, I didn't know what total pain was till I was aware. I became aware of palliative care. It's also when we say total pain, even the physical pain reported by a patient is compounded by his or her current life circumstances. There could be various instances which can be taken in. Let's look at a very, very trivial example. Something that can happen to you, me, anyone, is basically I wake up one morning with a terrible, terrible migraine headache. And I realize that, uh, uh, I'm unable to go to work. I'm late. There's too much traffic on the way. I get stopped by the cops. It's just a terrible day. I reach office, I get blasted by my boss because I'm late and I haven't been able to complete some work. And if you ask me what my total pain on that moment would be, I would say it's around 7 or 8, because it's just not the migraine, it's everything in that day, that circumstances on that day has caused me so much pain. On the other hand, if I wake up, I get a nice cup of tea, I'm able to do some maybe yoga or meditation. I have my breakfast pack. I call up my boss says, you know what, take go work from home today. Why don't you take some rest, um, and see if you can work. And if you ask me in the same migraine headache what my total pain would be, I would say it's around close to 4 or 5. So it is your current life circumstances at that point of time that really, really make a difference. What is social diagnosis? We've all know about physical diagnosis, and you've all learned it over the years and practiced it. It is an understanding of the psychological, biological, social, and environmental factors operating on the person and in his or her situation. So when we talk about total pain, illness-related suffering is much more than just physical distress. Um, we've already been through it. There is physical, there's psychological, there's socioeconomic, and the spiritual aspects that create total pain. Why is psychosocial care important in palliative care? It is important because other than for people living with a life-limiting or a life-threatening illness, or the awareness of approaching death can cause unique stresses and challenges for the patient and also their family. A serious illness disrupts individuals' thoughts and feelings, relationships, social and spiritual supports, financial stability, and spirituality. So we'll look into all these factors. Through the assessment that is being done, there would be an exploration of the process of gathering information about the person. Like, if information gathering cannot be done in one sitting, it is a time-taking process. A rapport needs to be built. Sometimes the patient is unable to provide information. We need to gather information from their caregivers or other family members as well. We need to select our goals and interventions depending largely on what is being assessed. The aim of the assessment is to identify problem areas which result from illness, which may influence the well-being of the patients and their families. The assessment, like I said, involves collecting information, identifying and honoring strengths, resources, and needs. So how do we do that? How do we just collect all the information when, especially in a scenario where the patient has to immediately get admitted? They may be in a serious case, they may have serious symptoms which need to be addressed. So how are you going to gather information? And how also the important thing is that sometimes we feel the doctor doesn't have enough time, right? Like to gather all this information. So the importance of the interdisciplinary team also comes in. And together you need to formulate a plan of care for the patient, not just you as a doctor, but your other team members like nurses or medical social workers, if you have psychologists or counselors, um, physiotherapists, other staff as well who would help, and together they can formulate a plan of care. Like I mentioned, assessment cannot be done at one sitting. It's an ongoing process, and it changes during the course of the illness. So as the psychological needs of the patients and family caregivers often change over the course of illness. We need to have purposeful observations and conversations while assessing patients. Some of the sources of information where you could receive information could be through the patient itself, if the patient is able to answer. It could also be a caregiver. Some of the other collateral sources could be friends, relatives, neighbors, etc. And for us, people in palliative care, we visit homes, so seeing the home scenario is also important. So home visits are crucially important for us. Let's just keep a case study in mind, which we'll go through over the course, over this session. Let's talk about a 33-year-old lady, Mrs. A, who's been diagnosed with CA rectum in 2014. She had chemotherapy and radiation followed by colostomy. She was referred for pain management. At the time of registration, she was presented with severe pain, infection, and a foul smell from the colostomy site. She looked anxious and very scared and had no idea about palliative care. From the present medical records, and present disease progression, the team had an impression of a very bad prognosis. She is a widow and her sons are 11 and 8 years old respectively. So now you can see this case study about Mrs. A is presented, and we'll talk about it through this session. So what are the important areas that need to be assessed from the point of view of total pain? We'll go through the patient overview, where most of the times the patient overviews are taken in a healthcare setting, but it will be a more in-depth patient overview, insight of the patient and the family overview, also the socio-economic overview, psychological overview, spiritual overview, and psychosocial, psychosexual overview if it is applicable, and interventions and other plans as well throughout the session. In patient overview, we look into basic demographic details, occupation before and after the illness, primary caregiver information, and the relationship. It's important. Most of the times when you register yourself, you provide basic demographic details, which are generally collected at most healthcare settings. We generally don't ask what their we just ask the question of what their occupation was, is currently at the moment. And so before and after the illness is also important. And obviously we need to know who the primary caregiver is. Most of the times we assume it would be a spouse, or it could be also the parents, it could be children, it could be a brother or a sister or a distant relative who could be a primary caregiver. In some cases, it could even be a friend. So it is important to gather this information. And insight is we'll have to know what the patient thinks of the diagnosis, prognosis, and palliative care in general, which is collected. In family overview, you're all aware of what the genogram means. And I'm not going to go into the details, where most of healthcare settings do collect a genogram of the immediate family. We are going to look into the family dynamics and support systems, also history of illness in the family as well. So let's talk a little bit about the genogram, which is also popularly known as the family tree. A genogram is a graphical representation of a person's family for at least 3 generations, which tells us about structure, dynamics, strengths, and resources. So when we say generally, most of the focus is on the immediate family, but we should try to look at least, okay, if not 3, maybe 2 generations, and also not just the immediate family, the extended family as well. It plays a very, very important role. The reason being, sometimes if the family doesn't have a breadwinner at that time of illness, you could have a distant, you could have a cousin who works abroad who is actually providing financial stability to the family or assistance to the family, and that person could be the decision maker. So if you just put in the immediate family, you will not be able to know who is assisting the family in various terms. So it is important that we have the extended family added to the genogram as well. And it is a versatile clinical tool for assessment, and you can identify relationships, patterns in the family as well. And you can also look at strengths and resources in the family. And some of the types of information that could be available would be name, age, educational profile, and other emotional relationships and all in the genogram as well. So you can see here you can see Mr. and Mrs. A. Mr. A is deceased. Mrs. A has a good relationship. You can see these red lines. I'll go into the legends of what these legends mean and what these line means. And so we're looking into almost 3 generations. We have the grandparents, the current family, and the grandchildren as well. So we're taking to everything into account into Mrs. A's story and case study. Some of these legends are important. This is just an example where you know about the child, about their children, whether it's an adopted child or whether it's a foster child or did they have a miscarriage, abortion. It's depending in the kind of care and how you want to, or if they have twins, we'll have to prepare the genogram. So these are the various legends. Like you could see in Mrs. A's genogram, she had a hostile relationship with her in-laws. And so you know that you would not ask for any kind of help or assistance from the in-laws because they may not be able to provide or be there for her at that time. So we need to see this. And like I said, within a family, there could be various types of relationship patterns that run. There could be harmony, there could be hostility, there could also be violence. And it's important to know, especially if you feel the decision maker is violent, if through the case history and stuff you find out that someone's been violent in the family, you wouldn't want to ask them for decisions because that's not going to be the right plan of care. And so it's important to know these relationship legends as well. And most of the times it's taken from the patient's perspective or the caregiver's perspective, but it is important for us to take that into consideration because um, it's their dependency on the family on how they can also help. So it is important for us as healthcare workers to know that. An ecomap, something which is a pictorial representation again, just like the genogram, but it looks at the patient family and also the social environment and its relationship with the larger society. Ecomap is something which is not very commonly used. It's just a snapshot view of interactions of the family with other systems. It could be extended family, it could be individuals, associations, organizations, local government. I'll just go into detail of that. So you can see this is the family. If this is Mrs. A's family unit, so many factors could play an important role. In India, neighbors play a very important role. Workplace, government services, local services, your religious institution, friends, clubs, schools, family. So when you create a eco map, you know what works for them where, and it's important. I'll go into a more detailed eco map. So you can see this is an eco map of Adam and Louise and their children, Michelle and Greg. If you look, so the church doesn't have a good relationship with Adam, but you can also see Adam's hobbies and friends don't have a good relationship with Louise. So this says a lot. So for it would be, and the church has a good relationship with Louise and her child Greg. So if we want to mobilize resources for Louise, we can get it done through here. And the legends here, the straight line talks about a positive relationship, a tenuous relationship. The zigzag line is a stressful relationship. And 2 lines create an energy flow. That means there is mutual understanding or liking, and line thickness is the intensity. So, and you can also see the school doesn't have a good relationship with Craig, but however, the school counselor has a good relationship with Craig. The college, in Michelle's case, she's good with college, her sports scholarship, she loves sports. And also, so these are some of the things that you could look, and it will say a lot about the family and their relationship with the larger society as well. And this will really help. So why an eco map is because sometimes you need to mobilize communities to help out patients as well. And for example, even if they come to a palliative care center, how is the relationship with our staff. We'll need to look into all those aspects. Sometimes in Kerala, what really works is the local panchayat plays a really important role. We can mobilize some of their services or get help from the community to help the family in time of need. For example, the mother and father are in the hospital, the children are alone. So get to know that, okay, there is a neighbor who's helpful, so the children can be taken care of by the neighbor. So these kind of information really, really helps. The socioeconomic overview is very, very important. Um it gives you a larger picture even in your plan of care for the patient. Sometimes the patients are referred to really, really expensive treatments which can completely damage and destroy a family financially. So we need to look into what we can do. We need to know about adequate clothing and shelter, who's the breadwinner of the family, who controls the finances, what are the sources of income, if the mother is also earning, where is she earning from, who else is providing income to the family, and whether they have any sort of property where they're getting rent, and there are various things. Are they going through any debts? Because a lot of times people take heavy loans to maybe buy a house or procure something like a car, or it could also be for education loan for the children. So we need to know the debts that they are going through. um, Also social support, are they currently, are they taking in any government schemes, or there's any other local financial support that is being given to them? And the education of the children is crucially important, because most of the times in disease ravaged families, one of the first things that get affected are the children's education. When And there are many times the children have to drop out of school, and so it is important to know all these points, and to see so a lot of times there are various other organizations that look into maybe the ration card, to see what kind of a ration card do you have, and other they may to get more evidence, you can ask them for paperwork and stuff like that, but it's completely depends on the organization and its policies and how they wish to take it. um, what are the other possible social impacts? Could also be social isolation, especially when a lot of times there's a taboo around terminal illness or something like that. People may feel that you're cursed, or you may have done something in your past life to get that, or something like that has happened. So especially in various rural settings, it is very, very common that the family can get isolated. There's also dependency, there's financial instability, there's lack of social support, there could also be debts and lots of work. In possible psychological impacts, we will look into the psychological overview, where there could be feelings of shock, uncertainty, and hopelessness. This could happen, especially when you get to know about what your diagnosis is, and many families are shocked for a very long time, or they may be in some sort of denial as well. There could also be anticipatory grief. When you say anticipatory grief, it could be, for example, I know I have cancer, and oh my God, what's going to happen to my children once I'm gone? Or who's going to take care of my wife? Who's going to take care of my elderly parents? So there are just so many, and this grief, anticipatory grief, can build up over a period of time as well. And sometimes the patients have poor insight of the illness, or they may not know enough, and things may be hidden from them due to lack of communication and various problems. So when they're trying to seek help, they may not be able to get right information as well. And obviously there is anxiety. There could also be suicidal ideations and wanting to hasten death because they are suffering so much, and also poor coping with the illness. Psychosocial and spiritual suffering is real, but can be difficult to recognize and treat. And this could also manifest as physical complaints. And some of these things very, very true to the current scenario as well, where a lot of people may be facing anxiety on knowing what's going to happen to their loved ones. Are we all safe? And you as healthcare workers may also be feeling it if you have COVID duty or anything like that, going back to your family and facing anxiety. And especially when you see it all over the news and newspaper, oh my god, there's lack of oxygen, you're not going to get care. There's so much anxiety all around. And so yes, it is important to even look at the psychological overview. And if a patient has been referred previously to a psychiatrist or a psychologist or anything, you could ask them to share some notes, or maybe if they've been diagnosed with something, or if they're taking any sort of medication as well, could be considered. Spiritual assessment is very, very important, and it's very unique to everybody. Spirituality does not mean your religious connection. It could also mean just your connection or meaning and joy, your strength and comfort, and hopes and concerns. Some of the areas, this is the Oxford Spiritual Assessment Guide, but some of the questions that you can ask in terms of how are you going to assess spirituality within that person and the connection are: who are the persons or communities you look to for support? What role do they have in your care? Do you have an image of a power greater than yourself? Has your life situation now affected your feeling about yourself, your faith, or your relationships? Meaning and joy, what has been the most important, who has been the most important in your life? What are you most thankful for? What makes or has made you happy? Why do you feel the most proudest or in your life? Strength and comfort, is there anything comforting to you now? What helped you get through difficult times in the past? Who or what is your strength now? In hopes and concerns, is there anything that you hope for? Is there anything that you feel is left unfinished? So these are simple questions, but can have the 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 patients or the families can give you a lot of deep answers, and sometimes very simple answers that tells a lot about their current situation, and also how to look into their spiritual needs as well. Psychosexual assessment, if applicable, a lot of times we use the psychosexual assessment for people who've had spinal cord injuries, or especially for newly married couples, like a lot of times, for example, I'm just giving you an example. We had a patient in our care who met with a spinal cord injury, and he'd just been recently married. So his wife comes into a situation where she's as in, they don't know about what their life is going to be. She's going to be a caregiver, she's expected to take care of the in-laws, but uh, she knew there was some difficulties happening. Will they be able to have children? There were a lot of questions. So some of these sample questions is, do you understand the importance of sex in life? A lot of times, because sex is a taboo subject in most of our settings, we don't ask these questions, and but it could be very relevant to know, especially when it has to do with a couple that you're dealing with, one living with a life-threatening illness, a young couple, or even an older couple. It's just, these questions are important. There are some sample questions that are given. And especially for people, like when I had mentioned spinal cord injury, when they're going through rehabilitation, is there anything that you want to achieve? Do you desire for marriage? And those kind of things, it's very, very important for us to know also. So by taking in all the assessment points, we looked into the total pain of Mrs. A. We know in physical, she was going through physical pain. There was also discomfort due to the colostomy bag. There was fatigue. There was a body image issue. There was lack of sleep. In terms of psychological status, she had anxiety about the future. She didn't know what was happening, what was going to happen. Anxiety about her children, who would take care of her children when she's not there. Unclear about her prognosis and palliative care. Also, she had suicidal ideation as well. And she was isolated and stigmatized from the family, and was going through a lot of anticipatory grief as well. In socioeconomic, you can see there are strained relationship with the husband's family. There's a loss of job. There's financial instability. There are huge debts. There could be it could be house rent also, and treatment and education for her children. Low accessibility to RCC of the hospital because the regional cancer center was very far away from our house. So these are some of the socioeconomic issues. Spiritually, she was like, why all this suffering? Why do we have to go through this? There was loss of faith in God. There was loss of connection within the family, friends, and the community. There was also loss of interest in pleasurable activities, something that she enjoyed to do. So if you look at Mrs. A Total Pain, there's a lot that you can read about her life and understand how you can plan the care for her. Physically, what you all have been learning, the symptoms were helped. Her physical pain was addressed. Also looking into all these things, the fatigue was addressed. But psychologically, there was a medical social that reached out to her to help her through, give her information about what needs to be done. And because they were unclear about the prognosis, the right kind of psychoeducation was given to them. And she'd also been provided counseling. In terms of socioeconomic, what we tried to do was we tried to get a counselor to help with the strained relationship with the husband and the husband's family. Because they had a loss of job, we were able to provide basic vocational rehabilitation that could have been done at home. And in terms of children's treatment and education of her children, we were able to mobilize resources and get a sponsor to pay for the education for her children. So she didn't have to worry or didn't have to be anxious about the future of her children as well. She was in extreme spiritual distress and loss of faith in God. So we were able to get a pastor to help her out in terms of her spiritual needs, and also get her to take up hobbies that she enjoyed, and have more meaning in life and enjoy more pleasurable activities as well. So if you can see through this, this is the eco map for Mrs. A. You can see both arrows. So you can Palomides, where the palliative care institution and us had a good relationship with her, the church, but the neighbors and her didn't get along. So we were able to create a plan of care through this eco map as well. There are various other psychosocial interventions that could be considered. There could be family meetings. You could also have supportive counseling, CBT-based communication, also facilitating psychoeducational support groups, bereavement support and services for the families, and also recommendations for government schemes and other financial assistance. A lot of times people are not aware, that there are some schemes, or they are unable to get those schemes because they don't have the time and they may be not able to leave the house. So those are some of the things that can be done, linking with community resources, vocational training, and regularly following up with them. So now I'm just going to come to you all. Just please do put in your answers in the chat box. Let's take the current scenario into the situation. What are the psychosocial issues faced by people during the pandemic? I've just given some pointers as well. Dr. Sunil, I can't see the chat box, so if you could read out. Let's talk about people who have family members suffering with COVID. What kind of psychosocial issues are they facing? If you could type out your answers in the chat box. Dr. Sunil, any responses?
Yeah. So, job loss,
Yes.
stigma, isolation, the fear that other members, especially those with comorbidities could be affected.
Yes.
Neighbors distancing themselves, not
Yeah.
able to meet them, not able to visit their loved ones who are admitted.
Yes.
Fear, very difficult time. Isolation, financial constraints,
Yes.
fear of worsening, not able to attend funeral, say the last goodbye. Children losing parents, food issues with the nuclear family, fear of death. Yeah.
So yeah, so all these answers are correct. Yes, this is a collective feeling where um, all these people may be facing the same thing. It could be grief, loss. If you could see, a lot of us are talking about this term dignity. What does dignity mean, right? Like, we're not giving dignity to the people who've died or their family members to perform last rites. So there is a lot of collective grief that is happening. Um, and there is even the healthcare workers. We also have a course, Pali COVID, that we do, which is a 5-day free training program for people working with COVID patients as well, where we talk a lot about what the health workers are going through. It could be burnout, it could be various other issues as well. Also carrying that anxiety of carrying that to your family members, losing your loved ones, what we are unable. And currently, for the last 1 month, a lot of people have been saying, what if we weren't able to are not able to get appropriate help or help on time for our family members. So you can imagine the kind of anxiety that is there. If you've seen, I didn't want to share pictures because I'm sure all of us have seen enough. There were times where people outside the hospitals were so anxious because they weren't able to get in or weren't able to receive any sort of care on time. So you can see, more than just the COVID or more than just the virus, there's a lot of psychosocial issues that are happening across at this current time as well. And it continues for people living with life threatening or life limiting illnesses as well. Any other points that Dr. Sunil, that we've missed on? And so yes, so thank you for all for your inputs. So now let's move on to talking about dignity. Some of the terms that are being used a lot for the current situation. Or what is dignity? What does it mean? Like, uh, why is dignity important? How can we help a patient? You know, so the inability to acknowledge personhood, the insensitivity of not acknowledging personhood can be psychologically devastating. So for me personally, my dignity is my independence, my financial independence. Uh, I don't want that to be taken away. So that's something that I personally feel is my dignity. It could mean something else to someone else. So this is Dr. Harvey Max Chokhanov, who's worked extensively with dignity therapy. Some of the work really needs to be read about, and how we can acknowledge a person's dignity, and especially for patients and their families as well. The ABCD of dignity conserving care is A stands for attitude. It's what attitude you have towards your how you treat the patients and their family members as well. Even your team members or anyone who's working with you, it plays an important role. Your behavior, compassion. Uh, a lot of times we hear the term, especially at this current time, where people are facing compassion fatigue. And so it is important for us to address these things as well. And dialogue, communication is very, very important. You have a session on communication as well. Just want to read out a lovely quote by a Buddhist monk. Her name is Pema Chodron, which talks about compassion. And it says that compassion is not a relationship between the healer and the wounded. It's a relationship between equals. Compassion becomes real when we recognize our shared humanity. And you can see it's through compassion that we've been able to, a lot of times we've been able to at least move through this pandemic as well. So even in terms of persons of suffering with a long-term or a terminal illness, it's very, very important. And as healthcare professionals, we need to address this ABCD very, very importantly, and look into our patients like that. Like a caregiver is important, and we just wanted to bring this in, that there are only 4 kinds of people in the world: those who have been caregivers, those who are currently caregivers, those who will be caregivers, and those who will need a caregiver. So all of us in some point in our lives would be caregiving. Respect those individuals, acknowledge the complex role. There are a lot of times in a healthcare setting, they call the caregiver as a bystander. In psychology, there's something called the bystander effect. It's people who don't do anything, and which is completely wrong, because the caregiver is on the front line. They are fighting a battle most of the time. So let's not dehumanize them by calling them a bystander. Let's call them caregivers, and it's important. Uh, a very, very simple question, but can really bring out a lot of like simple and sometimes really deep answers. Yeah. So what do I need to know about you to help you better? As a healthcare professional, try this. Try asking this to one of your patients. Sometimes a person may say something as simple as, "Oh, I love ice cream." And then you will be wondering, like, what are we like talking about ice cream? The person has a life-threatening illness, may not be able to live, and he's talking about ice cream. So you can, from that answer, take in, okay, maybe the person likes simple pleasures in life, or maybe enjoys that moment that he or she has family with that ice cream, and for to go out and eat ice cream. Sometimes you may also get answers like, my father abandoned me when I was 10 years old. So when someone responds like that, that they may have some sort of abandonment issues, or they may feel that they may be abandoned in this state. So it is important that we as healthcare workers, with just a simple question, address these needs and talk to the patients and the caregivers. So please do try it. What do I need to know about you to help you better? It will really, really, you'll be pretty much amazed at what you hear from people. Some of the other helpful questions can be in terms of your illness experience. How do you define your dignity? There's a lot of times when the breadwinner of the family becomes ill, and then now that person's not allowed to make any decisions because they're ill, right? They have illness. So what tends to happen is they lose their autonomy. Others are making the decisions for them, even to like eat the next meal, someone's making a decision for them. So there are a lot of times people lose their sense of dignity. Or there was a time where currently in many ICU wards, where in some of these hospitals where uh, a lot of these catheter change or basic personal hygiene wasn't, there was no screen in between, and it was happening with the other patients in the room. So there's a lot of times that also could make a person lose their sense of dignity. What supports your sense of dignity is an important question. Do you believe that dignity is something that you hold within you, or is something that can be given or taken away from others? These are some of the helpful questions. And first, you need to ask these questions to yourself, like, what is my sense of dignity? What does it mean to me? How would I want to be treated, or how would I not want to be treated? And how can this affect my sense of dignity? So it's a very, very personal feeling. It may be uh, I can't give you an ABCD, okay, this is right or wrong. Everyone has a different sense. Just like spirituality, this sense of dignity is also very unique to each individual. This is a picture taken for one of our patients who didn't have very long. This is an advanced wedding anniversary cake. So some of the times these kind of moments, play a very important role. And one of the things this pandemic has taken away from us is, physical contact, and we are unable to do these kind of gestures, for with our patients and their family members. A lot of times. they're unable to even call their families, or but there are times the healthcare workers have facilitated even a video call with their family. Um, so these kind of things really, really help. And so we need to come up with some creative ways to make their last few days better as well. Um, For some patients, dignity is maintained with something of their essence will survive beyond the death event of death itself. You've come across this term legacy. There's a lot of time. The term legacy is generally defined by, um, okay, it's defined by property and how much business and what do you leave behind. But it's a lot more than that. It's when a person, especially towards the end of life, uh, wants to leave something behind, like not just physical property or anything like that, just a memory. It could also be just a simple happy memory, right? So uh, so it is important, like for example, you could have someone like record a patient's experience or talk about their family members and share it with them. Also, they need to be uh, just for how your family remembers you. Everyone wishes to be remembered. No one wants to be forgotten, right? So it is important that we conserve that dignity. And there are various small ways. Everyone has a smartphone. You could do a recording, you could do a video call. There are various ways that we can conserve dignity as well. So like I mentioned, some of the interventions are providing information. A lot of times there's so much lack of information from the time you move to the receptionist desk to you go to the doctor and you come back to your family. There's just sometimes there's a lot of gaps in communication and the information that you hear. And so it is important to provide that information. And liaisoning is very important. Like I'd mentioned, there are so many sometimes schemes and stuff that people are not aware of. So we need sometimes to liaison with the government or the local government to make something happen for the patient. And facilitating all this is very, very important, because um, there are times that there's no one there to do it for you, right? So you can seek help. Also, rehabilitation, looking to bereavement support, follow up, counseling, psychoeducation, vocational rehabilitation can be provided. Now, if you feel that you aren't able to do it, try to mobilize the resources around you. Um, Draw that eco map. Do you think there's a local NGO that maybe can help them, or there's something that can be done? So there is a patient here. You can see he's making umbrellas. He has a spinal cord injury and lives in an inaccessible, but now he can make a living for himself and his family. There's a person who draws paper pens. He also has a spinal cord injury, a stitching unit, maybe goat rearing. There are various vocational rehabilitation that can be provided, and you don't need to do it. You just need to mobilize them to the right points. And there are various NGOs also working towards this. So it is important that we are able to get that information. And like I keep mentioning, it's you don't have to do it alone. You can have your interdisciplinary team do it, but you need to consider this. If the family is not going to have any sense of earning or anything after their treatment, or or they've lost their job, we need to see on how we can help the family out as well. Support for children and educational and emotional, that's some of the work that we do here. It is crucial because, like I said, one of the first things is children drop out of school if the family has been um, uh, disease stricken, and also if they've lost jobs and there's no financial stability. Most of the times the children education has stopped, and there are a lot of local NGOs or organizations that are willing to fund education support. So all we need to do is just look out, mobilize the resources in the community, refer the EcoMap again and see how they can be helped. Just some of the things to remember are we need to evaluate our interventions. It is very, very true, because it keeps changing with time as well, right? So we need to see what's working, what's not working, assess how the patients and the families are benefited. Assessments have to be revised and updated. Good documentation is invaluable. Like, it really helps. Even if Even if someone on your team who was in charge moves on to another job, it is important that we document this. And even if the same patient comes back a few years later in our care, we are aware about their condition and what their condition was. So we are able to make that plan of care with more mindfulness, and provide better care for them. Wherever possible, use research validated techniques. There's an art in science and psychosocial care, just as in medicine. So let's not forget that, and try to mobilize available resources. You can see a lot of time, sometimes the disease treatment can be so expensive for many patients who are not able to afford it. Or so you can see, you can also mobilize crowdfunding platforms, and which are actually free to use at the moment. So there's Millap, there is Keto, and various crowdfunding, and you can see a lot of time you get these mails or maybe notifications about this child has cancer, they need help for treatment. So these are the kind of things that you could look into if individually you want to help. But however, try to mobilize the best available resources. Look into the communities, look into the neighborhoods, local NGOs, anyone that can help, and to better care for the patient as well. And just before I end, just wanted to end with this quote: you matter because you are you. You matter to the last moment of your life, and we will do all we can, not only to help you die peacefully, but also live until you die. This is by Cicely Saunders, who is the founder of the first modern hospice. So thank you everyone for your generous listening. I hope I wasn't too fast, sorry. But let's keep it open for any questions or queries that you may have.
Thank you, Shreya.
Yes.
Any questions?
Maybe I should ask the questions.
Yeah.
But so we should go through the case study and then have the discussion.
Yeah.
And we'll come back
I
to
want
the
to ask
question.
a question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Ma'am, like a lot of time, some terminally ill patients, they are very angry all the time. And like, I have my brother-in-law who is suffering from myopathy and he's bedridden. So he's always angry with us. I mean, no matter how much we talk to him or whatever we ask him, he is always angry with us. So how do how do we deal with the anger? I'm always at a loss to understand.
Thank you, Dr. Sheila. So a lot of times behind anger is a fear, and that's what triggers anger most of the times. So we need to know why he's angry. Is because what does he fear the most? It could be he feels, I'm just giving you examples, but it could also be his condition at the moment. He may be fearing death, he may be fearing what's going to happen, he may be having anticipatory grief. So let's not look at the anger. Anger is just the outcome, but there could be fear behind his anger as well, and that is what we need to address. And as family members, try to talk to him to see why he's angry. And recently I had an experience with one of my family members as well, who was in the ICU and very angry, and like he wasn't picking up our calls, and like it was a really bad scenario. And one of the reasons is because he felt abandoned being in that state. So that sense of abandonment, like that fear of abandonment, like made him angry. And then so we Dr. Sheila, maybe you need to see not just the anger but the fear behind the anger. It's crucial. Anyone has any suggestions? This may not be right or wrong, but I think it's most of the times people are angry because they fear something.
Okay. Can I directly ask him, like, what do you fear about? Can I directly question him, ask him about his fears and all?
Yeah,
Is that advisable?
a little. You can. Maybe you can ask him that question about dignity. What do I need to know about? What can you tell me so I can help you better?
Okay, yeah.
Start with something like that, and then move to what is it that you really fear. We understand what you're going through. Do you like to talk to us about it? And so there are, and generally when it comes to people who are terminally ill and stuff, people start making decisions for them, right? Like this lose their sense of autonomy as well. A lot of time it happens, and so we need to bring it down, talk to him as not he's your family member, or talk to him as a friend, or maybe whoever he's comfortable with. Just, but you need to know what's the fear behind this anger. Why? What is he really feeling? That's just my suggestion. But I hope it works, Dr. Sheila. If it doesn't, do let me know. We can go into deeper.
No,
with
I will definitely try, ma'am. I will definitely try.
I would like to add one more point to what you have discussed. If you ask a person, are you in fear? Then if somebody asks you, you think of yourself. If I ask you, you may tell, even if you are in fear, you will tell, no, I am not in fear. But patients who are terminally ill or near end of life, or due to patients with any chronic illness, you ask them like this. In your situation, many patients have told us they have fear. So, what message we are conveying is that it is not only you. There are many other people in this situation have conveyed they have fear. Do you have such fear? So I think that would be the better question rather than asking, are you in fear?
Okay, sir. Right. I'll do that.
Thank you, Dr. Sunil.
Thank you, sir.
Any other questions, or we can move on to Dr. Meera's case study and then come back to discussion.
Ma'am, just in the end of life situation, most of the time, we find a conflict of and the teams. They don't want, the patient doesn't want to go to hospital. If at all they're at the hospital, they don't want to go into the ICU. But the relatives don't want to see the end scenes. In fact, we had a patient recently who had about bleeding from the wound in the hospital. They brought it to the hospital. They didn't, the relatives didn't want to see that scene again. So I said, put him into the ICU, put him into the ICU. But the patient is conscious and he doesn't want it. What do we do? It's a difficult scenario. How do we convince the relatives, especially to go home? In fact, that patient can go home, but they don't want to go home. And in fact, they want him to be in the ICU so that they don't want to see those very ugly scenes. Your comments?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Ravindran. Very common scenario, can happen to most of us. But here the reason the patient family wants to see put him in the ICU or is because they don't want to see they don't want to see those symptoms or those the results of the condition that he is in, right? A lot of times, one of the important things to look into is, which I think will be discussed during the end of life session, one of your last sessions, is advanced directives on what the patient wants. And it is important for us to look into that. We can share information about advanced directives as well, where the patient's need is addressed and discussed with the family, not just in the time when someone is terminally ill, but it could be done at a time when you're completely healthy and well as well. So, and also as healthcare professionals need to be sensitized to discuss this situation with the family, and also talk to them about whatever is, I'm not sure about the physical conditions, but If the patient does not want to be there, then sometimes I think we need to, I would say, listen to them, but we also need to communicate to the family about the needs of the patient. But Dr. Sunil, I'm sure you'll have better experience with this. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Shreya. I think what you told is right. In the first instance, we should not have allowed the patient have come into this situation. So as Shreya told, we should have talked with family about the goals of care, and we should have communicated that okay, if we have known there is a swelling, and if there is an ulcer and we feel that this is going to bleed, we can actually discuss with the patient and family maybe months before actually happening this, and they come to a conclusion that what we are going to do in such situation. That's point number one. But sometimes patient maybe patient we are seeing them for the first time, so there will be conflict of interest between the patient and family. So we are in a difficult situation. There is no doubt. There is no easy way to manage. But what we can do is maybe we actually discuss. We are always with the patient rather than with the caregiver. Both of them we have to look after, but still we are more with the patient. So we have to actually look at the interest of the patient. Here, the patient wants not to go into ICU. So we will call a family consent and talk to the decision maker. Maybe other members will also be there, but talk to them and ask them, why do you want to put him in ICU? And then there will be many answers for that. Even you can empathize with the caregivers at first, telling that okay, I see that you love your dad so much, that's why you want him in the ICU, isn't it? And then ask, is there any other reason you want him to be in ICU? So they will have their own answers. We don't know whether it is due to fear, or are they hoping that the patient will recover if he has gone into ICU. And next thing is asking them what are the benefits that can give him if the patient is in ICU. And you can actually tell him, considering the condition, are you expecting any advantage or any benefit if the patient in ICU? Most probably there is no benefit, that is not going to happen. And the next thing would be, are there any risk or harm that you will produce because the patient is in ICU? The answer would be yes, because the patient don't want to be in ICU, and he is actually he told you that he don't want to be in ICU, and you are now acting against his wish. Previously, you were all agreeing to his wish, but at this moment you are not agreeing to his wish, and the patient will feel very upset in his mind, because now I am helpless, and because of this helplessness, nobody is agreeing with you. Nobody, nobody is agreeing with you. And if in ICU, what are the things that is going to happen if the bleeding continues? There will be many lines for. I am talking about a terminal patient. Okay, I don't know what is the situation of this patient. So if the wound, the ulcer, there is a profuse bleeding, probably that is this advanced malignancy or something else. So that patient is going to bleed and will die. So if in the ICU, they will be doing many things like putting IV line, maybe ionodrops, and tubes in all the orifices, and maybe at last there will be CPR. possibly in ventilator. So are all these interventions going to give any good for him, or are we going to make him more in discomfort, or give him more harm? So the answer is yes. So these are the things that you have to ask to the caregivers. We will not answer it. They have to answer it. Is it going to give him any benefit? Is it going to give him any harm? So this is the way you can approach the patient and family. And maybe many families will tell that okay, now we understand that there is no need of or it is not going to be advantage or benefit to put him in ICU. But there will be some families we understand, but still we want to be in want him to be in ICU. In such situation, maybe you can go one more step and say that okay, now uh, uh, if the person is in ICU, you are happy. But if he is not in, if he's in the ward, you have to be, you will be worried and you will be sad. So what you can either make the patient happy, or you can make him in distress by putting him in ICU. It's your choice. What do you want? So most probably the caregivers will tell no, 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 we don't want him to be in distress. So these are the ways through which you can talk to the patient and to the family.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
There is
Yeah.
there are some questions in the chat box.
Yeah.
There is Dr. Angela has responded to the sometimes a family will think that they've not done enough if they don't give them that care, right? That is a lot of times the families feel that they need to, they think the utmost care may be putting them in an ICU and maybe putting them on ventilation, whatever is required. So we need to, like Dr. Sunil said, we need to address that with the family. Dr. Angela, you also mentioned in the current COVID scenario, what bereavement support can we give? One of the biggest challenges is a lot of people cannot like attend funerals, and you cannot visit families, but there are helplines. Even Pallium runs a grief and bereavement helpline called Sukhduk, which we can share the information on the chat box. It is important, and it's a free helpline where the patients can reach out if they need to seek help. But by just calling them and checking on them every few days, or having your team call them to check is sometimes enough, because a lot of times now, because we don't have that physical presence when someone is not there anymore, and like in funerals a lot of times it's 10 days, 13 days. A lot of families have there is 30 days, there's 40 days, people used to meet up, sit together, talk about the person. All that's not happening. A lot of times you could also suggest maybe a video call with the family members also, so they can have like a sort of a prayer meeting or get together on Zoom to provide some sort of support. But as healthcare workers, we can also put them through to other helplines that are helping them through this, and also the team can follow up with them. And yeah.
Dr. Sneha has also posted
Yeah.
a question. So there are some patients who doesn't show any emotions. So how to handle such situation? So this is also the same. You can actually ask the patient. You can say, I see that you are quite calm. Do you want to talk to me anything, or is there anything I can do for you? So actually in this situation what we can do, we have to ask an open question. And how to gain trust in such cases, there are some patients who will not speak much for a few days, and maybe through the continued effort from our side, what we are doing to the patient, Then after 1 or 2 days, they will find that, okay, this is the person whom I can trust, whom I can believe. So this will also happen. So it is through your action the patient will gain trust. So an open question, and whatever is following from the patient, patient may be telling anything, then you can follow up that, and that's how usually we have to go when the patient is not telling anything or not showing any emotion. Or even you can tell the patient that, okay, you are going through a lot of difficulties, but still I see that you are very calm. Just say this. So sometimes he may tell you that, okay, the people around me want me to be with a brave face. So that's why I'm not showing any emotion. So we will get many answers. So it's our duty to find out why it is happening. So every time you have to ask why.
Okay,
Okay.
sir. Okay, sir. Thank you.
I think we will move to the patient story now. So today's patient story will be presented by Dr. Meera.
Dr. Meera, can you unmute from your end?
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, doctor, you are.
I'm Dr. Meera Prasad. I'm a general practitioner. I'm practicing in Palakkad, that is in Kerala. Uh, this patient, she is a 39-year-old female, and she came with her diagnosis was heel burns of the head, face, neck, and upper chest, with stiffness of the neck due to scar formation and contractures. She had burns 2 months back. Her presenting complaints were: one, she came with difficulty to turn the head neck sideways, and it was more towards the right side. Next, she had discoloration and thickening of the skin of the face and upper part of the chest, and there was also difficulty to sleep at night. In the history, 2 months back, she was taking a lighted lamp from the shelf. The lamp slipped and fell on her, and she suffered burns on the head, face, neck, and upper part of the chest. She was rushed to the nearest hospital, that's District Hospital, Palakkad, where airway and breathing was assessed, and she was admitted and treated with IV fluids, analgesics, and antibiotics and daily dressings. She was subsequently she was given the physiotherapy, and she was also medicines were tapered, and she was discharged from the hospital. She said that she also had neck stiffness and pain on moving the neck developed while she was recovering from the burns, and also difficulty in sleeping was also there during the recovery phase. There was no past history of diabetes or hypertension or any other illness. On examination, her vitals like BP was normal, pulse was normal, she was afebrile. On inspection, the skin of the face, neck, and anterior part of the chest was blackened and of leathery consistency. On looking itself, it was very dark in color. The lips were pink in color, and the eyelashes were burned, and she did not have any hair on her head. This scar tissue was present on the side of the neck. On palpation too, the skin of the head and face and part of the anterior wall of the chest appeared thickened. All the systemic examination were within normal limits, like the respiratory system, normal vesicular breath sounds, and no added sounds, and the cardiovascular system was also within normal limits. And here, during the initial phase in the hospital, the burns were assessed to be around 10%. And it was a mixture of first degree, second degree, and second degree burns, actually. Next. Treatment, she was treated with IV antibiotics and analgesics and daily dressings with silver sulfadiazole. And stress was also given to high protein diet, and physiotherapy was also given to reduce contracture. She was now on multivitamins and tramadol. X-ray, extra and routine investigations were also done, and they were all normal. The psychosocial aspects of this patient were, the patient is looking anxious and very depressed. She said that she's being stigmatized because of a scarring and discoloration. And her husband is also not looking after her properly. And he's also taken to drinking more often. She was working as a maid in a nearby house. And now after this accident, she has lost her job. She has 2 children also. She has to single-handedly look after them. And also she lives in a very rural place, and they say, the villagers also say that she has been cursed by God, etc. These are the things she's suffering from now. Medications means she was on tramadol and paracetamol twice daily, multivitamins and moisturizing cream, and antihistamines were also given to reduce the itching. Physiotherapy, she does physiotherapy regularly, and pantoprazole, and also high protein diet. She's from a very low income. She's her family. She doesn't have much money, and she's having money problems too. I don't think whether she's taking the high protein diet, etc. Next is main concern now is that she wants to go back to work. She wants to reduce the stiffness of her neck. She wants to reduce the contracture focus. And she says that she's wants to look better also. She has got a discoloration on the face and neck and the head also. And she wants to look better. And summary is that she's a 39-year-old woman who has suffered from burns 2 months back, and now wants to reduce her neck pain due to contracture. She wants to, and also wants to look passable and go back to work. She also wants her family and the society to accept her. So the discussion points here are that how can you manage the patients? How will you help us reduce the stigma due to disfigurement? What can you do for the contractures, and can a plastic surgeon help? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Meera. The age of the patient?
Yes, yes, sir.
Age of the patient?
She's 39-year-old.
Okay, married.
She's married, and she has got actually she came for a follow-up just 2 weeks back. She came just like that, and
Okay.
she said she has 5 children, and main thing is she has got a contracture in her neck. She cannot extend her neck properly,
Yeah.
and also she has developed, now she's not able to open her mouth also. A little, she finds it difficult to open her mouth. Side microstomia is there. That's also because of the contractures.
Okay. So anybody experienced in this field? In the burns management and rehabilitation? Somebody?
Even I have never seen a patient like this. I think because of the COVID crisis, so many other different patients are coming to us, general practitioners, because usually they go to medical college or to a district hospital. Now they are forced to come to the local doctors.
Yeah. So, how is her pain with tramadol and paracetamol?
She's much better now. Her skin is looking paler now. Her color is slowly coming back to normal. I think
Mhm.
she's getting some family support is there. She came with her eldest daughter. She was around 20 years.
Mhm.
I think like that she was looking better. But she's not able to the contractures. She's got neck contractures. She cannot extend her neck properly. For that, she has to see a plastic surgeon, I think.
Are there any surgeons in this group? No?
Only anesthetist. I think.
Okay. So, with my little knowledge and with I also spoke to a plastic surgeon regarding this patient. So, from what I read and from the opinion of the plastic surgeon, the burns actually healed by scarring, and the scarring can cause three types of lesions. One is flat lesion with the discoloration, and then there are keloids, and then other one is hypertrophic tissue. So if the patient has only flat lesions, then moisturizer alone would be enough. But we have to also give compression garment. That's what the plastic surgeon told. It should be a tailor-made compression garment. There are some people who make it. But if it is keloid, some silicone gel.
Silicone gel
Yeah.
has to.
Silicone gel would be useful if it is keloid. But if it is hypertrophic, some people give injectable steroids into the hypertrophic tissue.
She's developing a hypertrophic scar-like thing on the anterior part of the chest. But other thing is like a contracture on the neck.
So if it is the contracture and if it is severe, surgical correction would be needed. Surgical release followed by skin graft. And
Yes.
even after skin graft, the patient needs splinting. Otherwise, that tissue will again go into contracture. That's what the plastic surgeon told. But I think here it is only 2 months after the burn. I don't
Yes,
think.
now almost 3 months. February must be February only.
Okay.
February, March,
So
around 4
if
months.
it is a severe contracture, the patient needs surgery, excision and skin grafting, surgical release and skin grafting followed by blending. Yeah, Dr. Chandra says the plastic surgery for the disfigurement and to improve
Yes,
neck movement and mouth opening, followed by blending. Yeah.
we can refer to Trishur Medical College. Trishur is the nearest medical college. She can
Yeah.
go, or Coimbatore. But now due to the COVID circumstances, she's not going.
But here there was another important question. Rajlakshmi, can you show the question regarding the
What?
stigma?
Pain, sir, pain, we can improve her pain by giving her Ultrasec, increasing the dose, or
It's under control as of now.
Pain is under control because they've tapered her medicines. She's now only on tramadol SOS, Ultrasec SOS.
So the important question is how can we help her to reduce the stigma due to disfigurement? So I think this is the most important question from this. So anybody has any comments on this? Rajlakshmi, you can unshare the screen.
Yes.
There are answers like counseling, need to talk with family. Also, Dr. Sundar, I wanted to add one more point to this. is that it was mentioned that she's not having a good, currently a good relationship with her husband, who has started to be more dependent on alcohol lately. So
Yes.
that's also something that we need to check on, whether it was before this accident happened with her, or it has started happening, because then she is currently facing stigma about her disfigurement at home, right? Like through not just the people around her, but as in the community or the colony or anything. It's maybe starting at home from a husband. So yes, we need to speak with the family and find out more about her relationship, because she has 5 children and she works as a maid.
Yes,
So
she's 5 children, 5 children.
yes, and a lot of dependence on them as well. And so I can see terms of any sort of substance dependence is there. A lot of money is lost in the families, and so that's something needs to be looked into. Also, I noticed that I'm not sure. You had mentioned that she can go to the medical college in Trishul, but does
Yes.
isn't plastic surgery an expensive ordeal, like for a lay person like
Maybe
me?
a government college.
Okay.
She can go to a government college. Maybe that's better option. I don't know.
So I think this need to address it with the family first. Anyone has any suggestions? Because we need to look at her husbands and her relationship as well.
Actually, I asked her to come with her husband. Next time when she comes, I asked her to come with her husband. We can talk to him also.
Yes. And you could also maybe do a one-on-one with him if you're able to build that rapport and
Yes.
check with him in terms of how what is his experience, what is he
She
feeling.
looks like a strong woman. Actually, she looks like her youngest child is around 6 years old,
Hmm.
and her oldest child around 18, 19. I think she looks pretty capable.
Okay. Okay. But yes, even if she has she has a big family of 5 children and she needs to take care, and currently she's not working. So and I'm unsure about how much her job pays, and
How much?
uh, and
Be very less.
yeah, and with the stigma also which people have for
Yes.
what's being said, who will hire her. So all those things also need to be addressed in terms of the social issues that are there.
Okay, I see that there are some comments in the chat box which says the appearance is very important. So a wig can be helpful. So that's one suggestion. And as Shreya told, we have to understand more about the family and relationship within the family. But the another important thing is that whenever if it happens to us, will any of us will go out with this appearance? We may be interacting within the house with our husband or children, but we will not be going out, because we know that our uh, we have a different appearance due to disfigurement now. So this is what we actually have to make sure some more the appearance has to be some more
Yes. Better.
I don't know, yeah, better, but uh, the wig will be helpful. But I think also uh, the there should be more motivation for her to go out. I don't know how many of you have seen a Malayalam cinema movie that is Uyere, in which the yeah the
Yes. Yes, sir.
heroine has undergone an acid attack on the
Yes.
face, and she has a very scarred face, and she was inside the house. She was not willing to go out. She was completely inside a room, and even her father and mother are not
With
allowed to
chemical
come in.
burns.
Yeah. So, but when she had a motivation from somebody else, she was able to come out, and then she actually um, did not consider that she had a burn, and she was very brave in that after getting that motivation. So I think that's what she also needs. We should give her enough time uh, to come out and face the people. But that will happen slowly only. But I think for the first time, maybe if some of our volunteers can take her to the society and get some interaction going on with somebody, I think that will be helpful. That will give her some
Yes,
to
the
go out
first
to the
time,
community.
the first time she came to us, she was wearing a very torn night dress and all, with a small baby, small child. That is, I said I'll give us one dress, and she said she removed her dress and she said I'll go and change, and she changed into that new dress and walked out. And next time when she came, she was wearing a normal dress, and I was feeling very happy about it. She was looking much better. So
One more suggestion
Yeah.
I had, Dr. Meera, is there is a organization called Burns India, which runs a burn survivor group. It's based out of Mumbai, but maybe a call to them to see if there's anyone who speaks, if she's comfortable speaking Malayalam or Tamil.
Okay.
If there's anyone who can help her out. So I think a lot of times peer support also helps to push you sometimes, like, okay, there are people like me as well who are doing what they're doing. So unfortunately, physically, maybe she may not be able to see them, but do a video call, or maybe have a connect with someone there, or they can probably mobilize this. So this would also help in this case as well.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Burns India.
Yes,
I'll look
Burns
into
India.
that.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll look into that.
Dr. Meera, I have a suggestion. One of my maid over here, she's also suffering from severe burns and she's got contractures on her neck and all. But she's a very bold female coming out to work daily. She's interacting. If you want, I can connect her with your patient. And
Okay, okay, okay. Of course. Of course, Dr. Sheila.
I think that would be very helpful because otherwise, if there was a possibility to meet her personally, but because of this COVID times, it may not be possible. But if they meet personally, then they will get ideas how
I
to
know.
go and survive in the society and family. This is applicable to any type of illness, because we have a paraplegic group where we have some people who are having a very productive life, and by seeing them, others also get motivated. So that is very important. So I think it would be very great if both of your patients can get
I know.
connected.
I know.
Any more suggestions? Okay. So the most important issue that we discussed in this patient story is the social isolation because of the disfigurement. And there are some ways which suggested is getting a wig to her, give motivation from by us, or if there are volunteers in the community that you can approach, you can ask them to take them to the community slowly. And the other one is peer support. So we have another patient whom we can get connect to each other. And if the contracture is severe, and I think this is, in this patient it is severe, so there is a role for plastic surgery for surgical release of contracture followed by skin grafting and splintering, which will be helpful. Thank you. Thank you, Shreya, for having you with us and having a very wonderful class. And thank you, Dr. Meera. When I saw this patient story, I thought how we will be able to discuss this patient story here. But I actually I saw that there is this patient is also actually she also is suffering from serious health related suffering. She also needs palliative care. The psychosocial suffering of burns, that's what we can understand from this patient story. And there are some ideas which came up from this group itself. So thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Meera, for presenting this patient story. Thank you all. Power to Rajlakshmi.